Jason Blazakis is a senior fellow researcher at the Soufan Center, and he, along with several others, have just authored a special report on Wagner called The Evolution of a Private Army. Jason, look, there's so many things I want to talk to you about Wagner, but first of all, you told me that you've been studying them for a very long time. Just what are your impressions about what's happened in the last 3 or 4 days inside Russia and with Yevgeny Prigozhin? It is startling stuff.
It certainly is. I started looking at the Wagner Group even when I was still in the U.S. government, long before I actually joined the Soufan Center as a senior research fellow. And at my time at the State Department, I was in the Counterterrorism Bureau, being in part of the Foreign Ministry. You have to be well informed about various affairs happening overseas. And it was in 2014 I first got a glimpse of what the so-called Wagner Group was, when it was part of the invasion force that the Russian Federation used to annex Ukraine. So starting from that point to where we sit now, to the culmination of the Soufan Center report that was just released, the organization known as the Wagner Group, led by an individual by the name of Yevgeny Prigozhin, has had a lot of ups and downs. And obviously over the course of this weekend, where we saw Prigozhin and a number of senior Wagner members and members of the Wagner organization take over a southern city and a military command within a southern city, and then start a foray towards Moscow after fighting in Ukraine and doing all the things they did in between, which I'd be happy to talk about as well. It was really quite something else. This was an individual, Prigozhin, who had a very strong and tight relationship with Vladimir Putin. And now when Putin talks about what happened over the course of the weekend, he won't even mention Prigozhin by name, which is something he does with individuals who have fled the Russian Federation or otherwise crossed him. Individuals who, for instance, were former intelligence officers who defected to the Russian Federation. He never talks about those individuals by name. His political opponents, who he feels threatened by, like Alexei Navalny, he never responds to him by name. He just says the individual, and that's the audience now that Prigozhin has joined.
Right. First of all, your report says evolution of a private army. Surely this isn't a private army in the classic sense. I mean, they operate with the blessing of the Kremlin and with the security service, I assume. And President Putin said today, when he was speaking to soldiers and thanking them for stopping a civil war, that the Russian government has given these guys, Prigozhin and Wagner, over $1 billion.
So this is an organization in its early days you could characterize as a private mercenary company that was really an organization that did advantage itself of plausible deniability. But over time, it became very clear, especially in September of 2022, when Yevgeny Prigozhin said he was the leader of the Wagner Group, that this aura of plausible deniability completely evaporated. And even before then, it was pretty well known that the Wagner Group was a tool of the Russian Federation. And like pursuant to Russian law...
So can I just stop you there?
Yeah, go ahead.
Plausible deniability. So it's run by the Russian government. They send them out to do things that they don't want to admit that the Russian government is doing, like?
Such as reaping the benefit of the natural resource exploitation that the Wagner Group is engaged in. Places like Africa, where the Wagner Group has essentially entered into commercial relationships with a government where they provide security services in exchange for access to natural resources, and those natural resources inevitably end up back in the coffers of the Russian government. And no doubt Prigozhin's taking his cut, right? He has to pay for his mercenaries. But it is an entity that absolutely has benefited the Russian Federation, both militarily and, very importantly, economically, and in terms of propaganda value as well.
So all the more reason that in an organization that is funded by the Russian government, receives the personal blessing of President Putin, no doubt operates on a leash, I would say, and let me ask you this, does it operate on a leash from the SVR or the FSB? It answers surely to the Russian security services, and because of that is an extension of the Russian intelligence services.
So Prigozhin, in many ways, is so important, or was so important, that he could bypass much of the Russian bureaucracy. Now, no question, there's coordination happening between the Wagner Group and Russian intelligence. Russian former intelligence operatives and special force members are who precisely is part of the Wagner Group. These are individuals that have very strong ties to the Russian military and intelligence apparatus. But what made Prigozhin special was his ability to directly deal with Putin. And who had the leash on Prigozhin was Putin, or so Putin thought until we saw this weekend.
So I can't help but think an organization and its leader, which answers to Russian special services or works with special services, must have had the blessing, and this is a big leap, but must have had the blessing of the Russian special services or intelligence services to take over Rostov-on-the-Don, this city in the south, take over the Defense Ministry headquarters, and then start moving towards Moscow. Because otherwise, why would Prigozhin ever think that he could succeed?
There may have been promises made to Prigozhin, and he could have been, frankly, fooled. He could have believed certain promises made to him. That's certainly one possibility that individuals made to him as a promise that, we will support you if you move forward. They provide, access to Rostov-on-Don. That was easy. No shots were fired, and then making a slow way towards Moscow, where there, was more interaction with Russian military, but it was far too easy. And there could be a number of reasons, that reason could be that he had certain promises and people didn't, cash in on that promise. And he was fooled. The second could be, Russia is a very corrupt place. A lot of individuals may just, have decided that they don't want to necessarily get in a firefight with the Wagner Group and die for Putin. In the end, it's very peculiar that Prigozhin decided not to continue to press forward because he had a lot of momentum. Would he have succeeded? Probably not. He pretty got himself killed. But nonetheless, he is almost inexplicable what he did in the end. Just say that the protest was over, as he called it, right?
But I mean, there's a lot of contradictions here, right? Because on one hand, you say, President Lukashenko of Belarus came out today and said in his negotiations with Prigozhin that, he told him you're going to be squashed like a bug. I mean, you got to turn around. And President Putin said, of course, our forces would prevail. But then he turns around in the next breath and says, when thanking the military, the military, which really never, in big numbers or any numbers that I saw on the ground in anything notable, blocked Prigozhin. Putin turned around and said, without you, we would have had a civil war. I mean, we were on the brink of a civil war. So which is it? I mean, Prigozhin and Wagner represented a huge threat to the state, and it was going to erupt in massive, bloodshed and gunfire in the streets of the capital and around Red Square. Or, they were just going to be squashed as bugs anyway. So they were never really a threat. But, thanks Army and Air Force for trying your best to stop them, if you really did.
Russia is always, to me, a country of contradictions. And the propaganda come out of the Kremlin is often doublespeak. So the idea that there, these competing narratives of there could have been a civil war and bloodshed would have spilled on the motherland, but at the same time, we would have quashed you. This kind of doublespeak is unfortunately very common within the Russian Federation. Communication often is very confusing when it comes out of the Kremlin. In the case of the Wagner Group in its activities over the course of the weekend, we can't deny the fact that the Wagner Group has tens of thousands of individuals who comprise it. Can't deny that the Wagner Group was comprised of individuals that had very serious backgrounds in Russian special forces or intelligence, and that they would have been a force to have reckoned with. Would they have won? Probably unlikely, but nonetheless, we have to keep in mind a lot of the Russian conventional forces and some of their best military assets are in Ukraine, not in Russia.
And a lot of them sympathize with Wagner and sympathize with Prigozhin because they feel that they were being fed into a meat grinder, and that Wagner had much better command structure and was much more successful in the battlefield than the Ministry of Defense and the classic Russian army under the defense minister Shoigu.
Absolutely. Shoigu, Gerasimov were common targets of Prigozhin's vitriol. And the Wagner Group had more successes when they focused on specific areas like Bakhmut than the Russian conventional military forces. And this is a source of consternation, obviously, that existed between Prigozhin, Shoigu, and Gerasimov. This idea somehow that he was spilling his blood for the motherland, while the corrupt venal leaders of the Russian military establishment, were sitting comfortably in their offices. Prigozhin liked to portray an image of being on the front line, of course, but not only that, individuals owe fealty to him. Just like when ISIS carries out prison breaks and essentially get new jihadists to join the fold, those jihadists feel loyal to ISIS, right? And the same thing really has happened with the Wagner Group as well. Prigozhin went to the prisons, as we know, in Russia, and released individuals who were going to spend their lives in dire circumstances in Russian penal colonies, and he's the one that got them out. They have some loyalty to this guy. He paid them. He got them out of jail. A lot of them willing to die for him, but they didn't want to die for him in the way that they were dying. And this perception was that they were dying because they were being used as cannon fodder because the Russian military establishment was corrupt.
Tell me, first of all, when we talk about Wagner or Wagner, as you pronounce it in Russian, is there anything to admire about this group when you look at the totality of what they have done in places like Mali and elsewhere? How would you characterize what they really are?
I have written both for the LA Times, US News and World Report, that this is an organization that, while it seizes the label of being a private military company, I think it's more along the lines of a terrorist group carrying out politically premeditated acts of violence, and it should be treated as a terrorist organization. Now, the United States government labeled a few months ago the Wagner Group a transnational criminal organization, and it certainly is that too. But these things aren't always mutually exclusive. It can be both a criminal organization and an organization that's engaged in terrorism, and I think that's a better way to describe the Wagner Group.
Why are these definitions important?
These definitions are particularly important because it can allow for governments to use tools in their arsenal to counter organizations that are terrorist groups in different ways than criminal groups. And just one very quick example is that in the United States, when a group is labeled a foreign terrorist organization pursuant to US law by the Department of State, it allows for the Department of Justice to provide essentially more prosecutorial leverage, not only to attorneys who may want to prosecute individuals who try to provide support to the Wagner Group, but it also could lead to individuals who provide that support behind bars for a longer period of time than, say, if they were a run-of-the-mill criminal organization or sanctioned for some other kind of violation pursuant to U.S. law. For instance, there are an array of sanctions that the U.S. government has placed against the Wagner Group, labeling it essentially an organization that causes instability in Ukraine. That's one thing, but it also, if you label it as a terrorist group, it may change the calculations of individuals or countries that want to do business with it. It could lead to risk calculations that may essentially lead to de-risking relationships that maybe the Wagner has with a country like the Central African Republic or with Mali, as an example. So it's a really important tool that has significant symbolic and normative value, but also has real teeth.
What happens to Wagner now, What do you think? Do they retreat to Belarus and, Yevgeny Prigozhin just uses them as a company that operates out of Africa and, dips into diamond mines and some of the things it was doing? Or do you think they're going to regroup and even a member of the Russian Duma has said, they're such an effective fighting force. Never mind what its leader has done, but we have to continue to support Wagner.
So I think the blueprint exists. The Russians have seen very clearly that the Wagner Group, as a PMC and what it eventually would become a transnational organization or a terrorist organization, is an effective tool of foreign policy and military policy for the Kremlin. And since the beginning of the 2014 creation of the Wagner Group, there have been other Russian private military companies formed since. Even Gazprom, the Russian gas entity, has its own private military company. Even the space agency has the so-called Uran for Uranus private military company. The space agency, they see that there's value in this. And absolutely, Wagner has created the template for the Russian Federation to emulate again, but perhaps they can be more effective doing it by having perhaps less of a wild card at the head of that organization. Because Prigozhin, he was a wild card. He was an individual with a really checkered background, an individual who has a criminal past, rose up, became exceedingly rich, but became uncontrollable. The future of the Wagner Group, I think, is yet to be written. I don't know what the final chapter is. There are a number of avenues that could happen. I think the most likely, though, is that Prigozhin's going to be confined in exile in Belarus. If he survives more than a few years, I'll be surprised, because Putin has a long memory, and no question, Prigozhin crossed a line with Putin. What happens to Prigozhin's assets overseas? I wouldn't be surprised if the Russian Federation subsumes them and uses them for their own benefactor. And for their own benefit. And by this, I mean, essentially, perhaps putting other so-called mercenaries in charge of the assets Wagner has overseas. I think it's going to be very difficult for Prigozhin to leverage those assets from Belarus. I think the Putin regime is going to stop that from happening.
But there are still some 25,000 fighters. We don't really know. There could be as many as 50,000, according to some of the estimates a few months ago. So what happens to these guys? If they refuse to go into the Russian army, which some of them no doubt will do, some of them may return home, but there's still a big fighting force. It's going to wind up at some of these abandoned army bases that Lukashenko is turning over in Belarus to them.
Absolutely. So the notion that you would have very well-armed mercenaries without any direction running around the continent of Africa in places like Mali and the Central African Republic, where the group and its membership have carried out gross human rights abuses, is very worrisome. So from my perspective, this is something the United Nations, the West need to engage with countries in which are hosting currently the Wagner Group to essentially evict those individuals as quickly as possible, because without that leadership, without any direction, I really feel for and fear for the people in those countries, the kinds of abuses that they could face. Now, in the scores of individuals, the thousands and thousands of individuals, I think the Russian Federation is going to make an effort to bring those individuals into the military fold, and those that don't comply, will have a Russian form of justice meted upon them. The idea, I think, that Putin said, or the spokesperson for the Kremlin said, that if they don't want to fight, they can go home to their families. I don't believe that for one moment. There's a war happening. Russia has lost a lot of face recently. They're going to need to deploy those assets effectively in Ukraine if they're going to be able to win the day there. And it's not looking good.
And it's interesting that you say, and you note accurately, that it's just not the Wagner Group that exists, but there are other of these private army for hire groups within Russia that the Kremlin's been feeding and funding. Would you not, like everybody outside the country, say, that's a dangerous thing to do, because you let the dog off the leash and he may turn around and bite you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Putin probably has a lot of regrets about the level of autonomy that he may have provided Prigozhin, because we've seen increasingly erratic behavior from Prigozhin in terms of his rhetoric, directing his vitriol at Shoigu and Gerasimov. The propaganda that he was pushing forward in terms of showing dead Wagner members behind him and blaming the Russian Federation for their deaths. That's not a good propaganda look for the Russian Federation. I think they're going to think very deeply about who's in control of any quasi-private entities in the future. And there's certainly going to be individuals, I think, that they could identify who lead future private military companies that won't be as reckless or as a danger to the Russian Federation's stability as Prigozhin.
Is there any final point you would make in terms of your report on what the U.S. and other Western countries should be doing to combat this group, other than just the classification beyond a criminal group to a terrorist organization? Is there anything else you think that they should do to meet these private militias head on?
One very important thing that's emphasized is to really shine a bright light on the organization's human rights abuses and help any entity that's investigating those atrocities, providing evidence so individuals can be successfully prosecuted for their horrific acts of terrorism and human rights abuses that the group has perpetrated time and again against people across the globe in places like Ukraine, Mali, the Central African Republic. We really do have to think about the civilians that have been harmed by this group in the end, and that there is appropriate justice for those that have carried out those atrocities.
Jason Blazakis at the Soufan Center. Thank you so much, Jason. It's always good to talk to you.
My pleasure. Great seeing you.